In February 1894, the Chicago Tribune published series of articles documenting the demolition of the world's Columbian Exposition buildings. Workers were systematically dismantling structures that had stood for less than a year. The Manufacturers Building, largest structure in the world at 31 acres under one roof, was being torn apart and hauled away in pieces. The Agriculture Building's elaborate facades were being broken up with hammers. The Transportation Building's golden entrance was being stripped and destroyed. Within 18 months of the fair's closing, almost nothing remained except the Palace of Fine Arts, and even that building would be gutted and reconstructed in permanent materials in the 1920s. The speed and thoroughness of this demolition, combined with the sophistication of what was destroyed, created questions that persist over a century later. Why build structures of such evident quality only to immediately tear them down? Why was there such urgency to remove every trace? And what exactly was being eliminated when the White City disappeared? The Exposition's buildings followed consistent classical style, with level of detail and finish that impressed contemporary observers. The Court of Honor, centerpiece of the fair, featured buildings arranged around central basin with elaborate fountains and sculptures. Every structure employed classical columns, ornate cornices, and decorative elements executed with precision. Richard Morris Hunt's Administration Building anchored the Court of Honor with dome 264 feet high, covered in gold leaf. The dome's proportions and the building's facade followed classical principles, but the execution showed refinement beyond what temporary construction typically achieved. Photographs from May 1893 show surface finish and architectural details that appeared permanent. Charles Atwood's Fine Arts Building, the only structure intended to survive the fair, employed Greek Revival architecture with Ionic columns and pediments. The building was completed in November 1892, just 6 months before the fair's opening. Contemporary accounts describe the speed of construction as remarkable, yet the finished building showed no evidence of rushed work. Louis Sullivan's Transportation Building departed from the classical white aesthetic, with polychrome decoration and ornate golden entrance. The building's layered arches, intricate surface patterns, and complex color scheme required extensive craftsmanship. Sullivan supervised the decoration personally through winter of 1892 and spring of 1893, working with teams of artisans to achieve the desired effects. The consistency across all buildings was notable. Every structure showed similar level of finish and detail. There were no half-completed areas, no obviously rushed sections, no evidence of corners cut to meet deadlines. Construction began in December 1890, when first ground was broken in Jackson Park. The site had been swampy parkland, requiring extensive drainage and grading before building could commence. Workers spent first months of 1891 moving earth, installing drainage systems, and preparing foundations. Actual building construction began in spring of 1891. The Administration Building's foundation was laid on the 12th of April, 1891. The Manufacturers Building's foundation began on the 3rd of May, 1891. Through summer and fall of 1891, workers erected frameworks for multiple buildings simultaneously. The structures used technique called staff, mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber, applied over wooden frameworks. This method allowed rapid construction of elaborate facades that resembled stone architecture. But examination of contemporary photographs reveals complexity that challenges this timeline. Image from August 1892, 9 months before opening, shows Administration Building with detailed ornamentation already in place. Photograph from October 1892 shows Court of Honor buildings substantially complete with finish work progressing. Daniel Burnham's daily logs, preserved at Ryerson and Burnham Libraries in Chicago, Document construction progress. Entry from the 15th of November, 1892 notes that staff work on manufacturer's building was nearing completion and that artisans were applying final decorative elements. Entry from the 1st of December, 1892 describes inspection of finished spaces in agriculture building. Peak employment at the construction site reached between 10,000 and 20,000 workers, according to official reports. These workers included carpenters, plasterers, painters, sculptors, ironworkers, and laborers performing various tasks. But the skill level required for the finish work raises questions. The decorative elements on buildings required trained sculptors and plasterers capable of producing classical details accurately. Contemporary accounts mention Italian and European craftsmen brought to Chicago specifically for the Exposition work. The Chicago Tribune published an article on the 8th of September, 1892, describing teams of Italian plasterers working on ornamental details throughout the grounds. Plasterer Antonio Garibaldi, interviewed in 1920 by Chicago Historical Society, described working on manufacturer's building in 1892. Garibaldi stated that he and other Italian craftsmen worked from detailed drawings, showing exact profiles and dimensions for every ornamental element. He described the work as demanding, but noted that having precise specifications made rapid execution possible. The presence of detailed drawings for every decorative element is significant. This level of pre-planning suggests either remarkable foresight by architects or possibility that designs being executed were not newly created, but were being reproduced from existing templates or examples. The staff mixture used for building facades was not mysterious. Charles Atwood's specifications, dated November 1892, listed precise proportions: plaster of Paris, cement, glycerin for workability, and jute fiber for tensile strength. Staff was applied in layers over wooden lath attached to timber framework. The technique had been used for temporary exhibition buildings in Europe since 1850s and was well established by 1893. But the quality of execution at the Exposition exceeded typical staff work. Examination of surviving photographs shows crisp details, clean lines, and consistent finish across vast surfaces. Montgomery Schuyler, architectural critic, wrote in October 1893 that buildings appeared to be marble even upon close inspection. Schuyler stated that only by touching the surfaces could visitors confirm they were plaster rather than stone. The speed of deterioration after the fair's closing supports the staff construction explanation. By November 1893, just weeks after closing, visible cracks and water damage appeared on building facades. Photographs from early 1894 show extensive deterioration on buildings that had appeared perfect 6 months earlier. The Exposition was extensively photographed. Official photographers Charles Arnold and William Jackson produced thousands of images. These photographs provide detailed documentation of buildings' appearance. Examination of these images reveals interesting patterns. Photographs from different angles and times show consistent architecture across entire site. There are no visible signs of construction scaffolding in images from opening day, suggesting buildings were fully complete. But some photographs show anomalies that generate questions. Image from June 1893 shows reflection of manufacturer's building in lagoon with detail and clarity suggesting substantial structure. Photograph from July 1893 shows administration building's dome with surface texture and shadowing consistent with metal or stone rather than plaster. These photographic details could reflect limitations of early photography, which rendered surfaces differently than human eye perceived them. Or they could indicate that building's construction was more substantial than official accounts suggest. The fair closed on the 30th of October, 1893. Demolition contracts were signed in November 1893. Active demolition began in December 1893 and proceeded through 1894 and into 1895. By summer of 1895, almost all buildings were gone. The manufacturer's building was demolished first. Workers removed the staff facades, exposing wooden framework underneath. The framework was disassembled, and lumber was sold as salvage. Steel trusses were cut apart and hauled away. The massive building disappeared in approximately 6 months. The Chicago Tribune noted on the 15th of March 1894 that buildings were coming down more rapidly than they had gone up. This speed has generated suspicion, but examination of demolition photographs shows that speed was possible because buildings were exactly what they claimed to be: temporary structures. Images show wooden frameworks being disassembled with conventional tools. Staff facades were broken up with hammers. The economic motivation for rapid demolition was clear. The land in Jackson Park was valuable. Leaving ruins would prevent use of the space. Salvaging materials generated revenue. And the longer buildings stood, the worse their condition became, reducing salvage value. After the fair closed, elements of its architecture appeared in cities across America. Classical style promoted by the White City became standard for public buildings, railroad stations, and civic architecture through early 1900s. The New York Public Library, designed by Carrere and Hastings and completed in 1911, employs architectural details remarkably similar to specific Exposition buildings. The main reading room's proportions match spaces in the manufacturer's building. Burnham himself designed numerous buildings after the Exposition incorporating White City elements. Union Station in Washington, D.C., completed in 1907, essentially translated Exposition architecture into permanent materials. This pattern appears in cities nationwide. Railroad stations, libraries, museums, and government buildings built between 1900 and 1930 show unmistakable connections to Exposition architecture. The 1893 Exposition was not the first international exhibition to employ classical architecture. The Paris Exposition of 1889 had featured elaborate temporary structures. The Vienna Exposition of 1873 and the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876 had used similar approaches. This context suggests Chicago was following established pattern rather than doing something unique. European experience demonstrated that large, classical structures could be built quickly using temporary methods, then removed efficiently. But examination of European precedents reveals differences. Paris expositions emphasized modern materials and innovative engineering. The 1889 Exposition's signature structure was Eiffel Tower, celebration of iron construction. European expositions generally promoted new technologies and materials rather than classical revival. Chicago's commitment to classical architecture, its rejection of modern materials in favor of traditional forms, made the 1893 Exposition unusual among international exhibitions. The Palace of Fine Arts, designed to be permanent, survived the demolition. The building was reconstructed in limestone in 1920s, replacing staff facades with stone while preserving original design. This reconstruction provides evidence about original construction. Workers removing staff in 1920s documented wooden framework underneath, confirming official accounts. But the reconstruction also reveals something else. When permanent materials replaced temporary ones, the building's appearance remained essentially unchanged. The proportions, details, and overall effect were the same, whether executed in plaster over wood or in carved stone. Some architectural elements were salvaged and incorporated into other buildings. Columns from various exposition structures were installed in churches and public buildings across Chicago. These fragments confirm that buildings existed as documented, but also that deliberate effort was made to preserve certain elements while destroying the whole. Jackson Park in 1889 was marshy lowland along Lake Michigan. Frederick Law Olmsted, hired on the 6th of August 1890, faced challenge of transforming 690 acres of swamp into landscaped exposition grounds. His plan required moving over 1 million cubic yards of earth. Olmsted's son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., supervised daily work. His field notes from November 1890 through April 1891 describe scale of earth-moving operation. Entry from the 15th of January 1891 notes 200 workers excavating lagoons using steam shovels. Photographs from August 1890 show undeveloped marshland. Images from May 1891 show graded terrain, with lagoons taking shape and foundations being laid. By October 1891, landscape was recognizable as planned exposition site, with major water features complete and buildings rising on prepared ground. The exposition's landscape included over 100,000 trees, shrubs, and plants. Many were mature specimens transplanted from nurseries across the country. Contemporary accounts describe landscape's completeness at opening. The Chicago Daily News reported on the 2nd of May, 1893, that grounds appeared as if they had existed for years rather than months. Trees were established and leafed out. Plantings were mature and full. This raises question about timeline. Transplanted trees typically require a year or more to become established. The fact that landscape appeared mature at opening in May 1893 suggests either that planting began earlier than documented or that horticultural techniques were more advanced than typically credited for the period. The exposition's electrical systems represented major technological demonstration. The Westinghouse Corporation's alternating current power system distributed electricity throughout grounds, powering over 120,000 incandescent bulbs. George Westinghouse supervised installation personally. His correspondence from February through April 1893, preserved at Heinz History Center, shows him negotiating with Burnham over technical specifications. The spectacular nighttime illumination became one of Fair's signature features. The Chicago Tribune published an article on the 15th of May, 1893, describing opening night illumination as magical transformation that made buildings appear ethereal and otherworldly. This electrical demonstration was authentic technological achievement using cutting-edge equipment. The fact that such advanced technology was deployed in temporary structures raises questions about priorities and planning. "46 nations constructed pavilions at the Exposition. These buildings provide comparative context for evaluating American structures. The German building, designed by Johannes Radke, was completed in September 1892. German government records show design process began in November 1891, giving construction timeline of 10 months. The French building, designed by Charles Dudert, used iron and glass construction. French exposition experience extended back to Paris. Expositions of 1,855, 1,867, 1,878, and 1,889 1889. This international context supports conventional explanation that Chicago's buildings used standard temporary construction techniques. But it also reveals that each nation invested substantial resources in impressive architecture for brief display. The pattern of rapid construction, sophisticated architecture, complete demolition, and lasting influence has generated alternative interpretation. This reading suggests that Exposition buildings were not newly constructed in 1890 to 1893, but were existing structures from earlier period, that the fair provided opportunity to display this architecture publicly one last time, and that demolition was deliberate destruction of evidence of previous civilization. This interpretation faces significant challenges. The construction was documented extensively in newspapers, photographs, and official reports. Thousands of Chicago residents watched buildings rise from empty parkland. The site's previous condition is well documented in historical maps and photographs showing undeveloped landscape. The demolition was photographed and described in detail. Images show wooden frameworks being disassembled, not stone buildings being destroyed. Workers' accounts describe removing staff facades and salvaging lumber, not demolishing permanent architecture. The architects left detailed documentation of their design process. Plans, drawings, correspondence, and calculations survive in multiple archives. But alternative interpretation persists because certain questions remain difficult to answer fully. The speed of construction seems remarkable, even accounting for temporary methods and large workforce. The sophistication of finish work seems exceptional for structures built under time pressure. The thoroughness of demolition and the urgency with which it proceeded create impression of deliberate erasure. Contemporary accounts of visiting the Exposition describe overwhelming experience. The scale, the visual coherence, the abundance of detail, and the spectacular setting created impact that many visitors described as transformative. Hamlin Garland, writer from rural Wisconsin, visited in June 1893 and wrote extensive description in his journal. Garland described feeling transported to classical civilization, experiencing architecture that seemed too grand and beautiful to be real. This visitor reaction is significant. People experienced buildings as impressive and important. The fact that they were temporary did not diminish impact. If anything, knowing buildings would soon disappear intensified experience. The 1893 Exposition occurred at a specific moment in American cultural development. The frontier was closing. Immigration was transforming cities. Industrial technology was advancing rapidly. The Exposition's classical architecture represented choice to align with European tradition rather than developing distinctively American style. This choice was controversial among architects and critics. Louis Sullivan called it architectural tragedy, but the public responded enthusiastically to classical design. The White City became a cultural phenomenon, influencing not just architecture, but urban planning, public art, and cultural aspirations. The 1893 Exposition buildings were a remarkable achievement, regardless of interpretation. Talented architects working with skilled craftsmen created impressive structures that influenced American architecture profoundly. The demolition, while thorough, was logical given buildings' temporary construction and deteriorating condition. The speed reflected economic realities and practical necessity. The lasting influence came from architecture's quality and from timing. American architecture in 1890s was searching for direction. The Exposition provided comprehensive demonstration of classical principles executed at impressive scale. But there remains something unusual about the whole episode. The commitment of resources to create elaborate structures for 6-month use. The level of detail and finish applied to temporary construction. The systematic and rapid removal of everything afterward. I am not arguing this was conspiracy to hide evidence of lost civilization. I am saying it was unusual pattern in relationship between architecture, time, and permanence. Buildings this sophisticated are typically intended to endure. Creating them for brief display, then methodically destroying them, represents choice that deserves examination. The conventional explanation is adequate for most evidence. Temporary construction using staff over wooden frameworks. Rapid building enabled by established techniques and large workforce. Demolition motivated by practical and economic factors. Lasting influence resulting from impressive demonstration of classical architecture. But the pattern is worth noting. The White City appeared, displayed architecture of remarkable sophistication and consistency, operated for 6 months, then disappeared almost completely within 2 years. The buildings influenced American architecture for decades, but left almost no physical trace. They were documented extensively, but exist now primarily as photographs and memories. Whether this pattern indicates something beyond official explanation, or simply reflects unique historical moment when temporary exhibition architecture reached peak of ambition and execution. The 1893 World's Fair remains event whose buildings continue to generate questions more than a century after their demolition. The fact that structures built to last months continue to fascinate and perplex suggests they succeeded in creating impression that transcended their temporary materials and short existence. The White City was seen, briefly and completely. Then it was gone. What remains is photographic record, architectural influence, and questions about why buildings this impressive were created knowing they would be destroyed. The answers depend on whether one trusts construction timelines, accepts economic explanations for demolition, and believes architecture's sophistication can be attributed to skill and training rather than something more mysterious. The evidence supports conventional explanation, but the pattern rewards attention. Machinery Hall housed working demonstrations of industrial equipment operating continuously throughout the fair. The largest steam engine, built by Alice Chalmers, stood 40 feet tall and developed over 2,000 horsepower. This massive engine weighed over 100 tons and required foundation capable of supporting its weight and absorbing its vibration. Installation of such equipment in supposedly temporary building creates questions. The foundations and supports required for industrial machinery exceed what typical temporary construction would provide. Contemporary engineering reports mention concerns about vibration and settling, but provide limited detail about how these issues were resolved. The Alice Chalmers engine's foundation, documented in company records preserved at Milwaukee Public Library, shows substantial concrete work extending 15 feet below ground level. This foundation was designed and installed in early 1892, over a year before the fair opened. The depth and mass of the foundation suggest construction intended to last longer than 6 months. After the fair closed, much of Machinery Hall's equipment was sold and removed. The building itself was demolished like other structures. But photographs of the demolition process, taken in spring of 1894, show workers excavating deep foundations to remove them completely. This level of foundation removal suggests either that foundations were more substantial than necessary for temporary construction, or that complete site restoration required extraordinary effort. The Court of Honor's central basin and surrounding lagoons required extensive plumbing and pumping infrastructure. The McMonnies Fountain, centerpiece of the basin, featured elaborate sculptural group with multiple water jets operating at different heights and pressures. Frederick McMonnies designed the fountain's sculptural elements in his Paris studio in 1891 and 1892. The bronze figures were cast in Paris and shipped to Chicago in early 1893. But the engineering of water supply, pumping systems, and drainage required parallel work in Chicago throughout 1892. Ernest Graham, engineer responsible for Fountain's mechanical systems, left detailed notes now preserved at Chicago Architecture Foundation. Graham's calculations from August 1892 show water supply system capable of pumping 4,000 gallons per minute through multiple jets and cascades. The system required underground reservoir, pumping station, and distribution piping all installed before Fountain could operate. Contemporary photographs show Fountain operating during fair with elaborate water displays. The system's reliability throughout 6-month run demonstrates successful engineering, but it also suggests infrastructure investment exceeding what temporary installation would typically warrant. After fair closed, Fountain was dismantled and bronze sculptures were dispersed. The basin was filled in and lagoons were partially restored to natural state. But comparison of pre-exposition and post-demolition photographs shows that water features' complete removal required more extensive work than their installation. This reversal pattern appears throughout the exposition site. Many foreign exhibits displayed objects and artifacts that arrived from overseas months before buildings were complete. The anthropology exhibits in particular included materials from archaeological expeditions, ethnographic collections, and cultural displays assembled from global sources. The Smithsonian Institution's anthropology exhibits, curated by Otis Mason, included materials from multiple expeditions. Mason's correspondence from April 1892, preserved in Smithsonian archives, discusses shipping artifacts to Chicago, even though exhibition space was not yet available. Mason wrote to Burnham on the 22nd of April 1892, requesting confirmation that buildings would be ready to receive materials by September. This correspondence reveals tension between exhibit assembly timelines and construction schedules. Foreign governments' participation required advance coordination. Germany's official participation was negotiated in treaty, signed on the 15th of March, 1891, before any exposition buildings existed beyond paper plans. German government committed resources and began assembling exhibits based on anticipated completion dates. The confidence required to make such commitments suggests either that construction schedules were considered reliable or that political and cultural motivations outweighed practical risks. The Japanese Ho-O-Den Pavilion on Wooded Island was designed in Japan, prefabricated there, shipped to Chicago in pieces, and assembled on site. The building arrived in January 1893, 4 months before opening. Japanese craftsmen supervised assembly, working through winter to complete structure. The fact that prefabricated building from Japan arrived on schedule and was assembled successfully demonstrates international coordination that extended well beyond construction site. American architectural schools studied the exposition extensively immediately after it opened. Course materials from 1893 and 1894 show that schools, including MIT and University of Pennsylvania, assigned students to analyze exposition buildings and create designs based on classical principles demonstrated at the fair. MIT professor William Ware published article in Technology Architectural Review in March 1894, analyzing exposition architecture. On pages 12 through 28, Ware discussed design principles visible in major buildings, comparing them to classical precedents from Greece and Rome. Ware's analysis treated buildings as products of architectural education, not as mysterious anomalies. Columbia University's architecture program used exposition photographs in design studios through 1900s. Professor Adolphe Cohn assigned students to measure buildings from photographs and reproduce plans. Student work from these exercises, preserved in Columbia's architectural archive, shows detailed analysis of proportions, column spacing, and ornamental systems. The ability of students to analyze and reproduce exposition designs demonstrates that architecture followed comprehensible principles. But this academic adoption also raises questions. If buildings were temporary structures built hastily for short-term use, why did architectural education treat them as canonical examples worthy of detailed study? The fact that leading schools used exposition buildings as teaching models suggests they were perceived as architecturally significant beyond their temporary status. The world's Columbian Exposition Company operated as business venture, expecting to generate revenue. The company's financial records show business planning that began in 1889, before construction site was selected. Revenue projections made in October 1890, documented in company minutes, preserved at Chicago Historical Society, predicted specific attendance figures and income levels. These projections were based on Philadelphia Centennial of 1876 and Paris Exposition of 1889. The company projected 25 million visitors and $15 million in revenue. Actual results exceeded projections with over 27 million visitors. But these business projections required confidence that construction would complete on time and that buildings would be impressive enough to attract visitors. The company began selling concession rights and exhibitor space in 1891, collecting deposits and signing contracts before buildings existed. This financial commitment created pressure to deliver on promises, but also demonstrates confidence in construction timelines. The company's insurance policies, arranged through multiple underwriters beginning in May 1892, provide interesting evidence. Policy documents, preserved in company records, show structures insured for values suggesting substantial construction. The manufacturer's building was insured for $3 million. The administration building for $1,500,000. These insurance values seem high for temporary construction, suggesting either that temporary did not mean insubstantial or that insurance companies overvalued the structures. Official exposition publications began appearing in 1892, before buildings were complete. Rand McNally published Comprehensive Guidebook in March 1893, 2 months before opening. The book contained detailed maps showing building locations, descriptions of architectural features, and illustrations of major structures. The accuracy of these advanced publications is notable. Comparison of pre-opening maps with photographs from the fair shows close correspondence. Buildings appeared as illustrated in publication. Layouts matched published maps. Descriptions of architectural features matched actual buildings. This accuracy demonstrates either that construction followed detailed plans precisely, with no significant deviations, or that publications were prepared based on actual buildings rather than anticipated designs. Given typical construction processes where modifications occur during building, the precise matching of advanced publications with finished structures is remarkable. Harper's Weekly and other illustrated magazines published articles about the Exposition in late 1892 and early 1893, showing buildings under construction. These articles included engravings based on photographs and architects' drawings. The images show buildings at various completion stages, providing visual timeline of construction progress. The Exposition's memory persisted long after buildings were demolished. Nostalgia for the White City influenced urban planning and architecture for decades. The City Beautiful movement, which promoted classical architecture and comprehensive urban planning, emerged directly from Exposition experience. Daniel Burnham himself became leading advocate for City Beautiful principles. His Plan of Chicago, published in 1909, proposed transforming Chicago with classical civic architecture, broad boulevards, and integrated park systems directly inspired by the Exposition. The plan was never fully implemented, but it influenced Chicago's development through early 20th century. But memory also transformed the Exposition into something more mythological than historical. In reminiscences from 1920s and 1930s, visitors describe the White City in increasingly idealized terms. The buildings became grander in memory. The experience became more profound. The demolition became more tragic. Writer L. Frank Baum, who visited the Exposition in 1893, later claimed it inspired his description of the Emerald City in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, published in 1900. Baum's Emerald City shares characteristics with the White City, including artificial color coherence, elaborate architecture, and dreamlike quality that seems too perfect to be real. This mythologizing process reveals how events take on cultural meanings beyond historical facts. The Exposition became symbol of lost beauty, vanished grandeur, and path not taken in American development. Whether buildings were actually as impressive as remembered mattered less than cultural function the memory served. Academic historians and architectural scholars have reached general consensus about 1893 Exposition. Buildings were newly constructed using temporary methods for specific purpose and were demolished afterward for practical reasons. The architecture was impressive but explicable through architects' training and skill. This consensus is based on extensive documentation. Contemporary newspapers, photographs, official reports, architects' papers, business records, and visitor accounts all support conventional explanation. No significant evidence contradicts this interpretation. But consensus does not eliminate all questions. Some aspects of Exposition remain genuinely puzzling, even within conventional framework. The speed of construction was remarkable, even granting temporary methods and large workforce. The quality of finish work exceeded what typically emerges from rushed schedules. The thoroughness of demolition was unusual, even accounting for economic motivations. These puzzles do not require alternative explanations involving lost civilizations or hidden history. They can be understood as reflecting exceptional achievement under specific circumstances. Talented architects working under time pressure with adequate resources accomplished something remarkable. Skilled craftsmen executed designs with unusual precision. Business pressures and site conditions necessitated rapid demolition. But acknowledging conventional explanations' adequacy does not mean pattern is not worth noting. The commitment of resources to create elaborate structures for 6-month use. The level of detail and finish applied to construction never meant to last. The systematic and complete removal of everything afterward. The lasting cultural impact of buildings that existed so briefly. I am not arguing this was conspiracy to hide evidence of lost civilization. I am saying it was unusual pattern in relationship between architecture, time, and permanence that reveals something about American culture at specific historical moment. Buildings this sophisticated are typically intended to endure. Creating them for brief display, then methodically destroying them represents choice about values and priorities. The choice reveals culture willing to invest enormous resources in temporary spectacle, willing to create beauty knowing it will be destroyed, willing to privilege experience over preservation. What happened in 1893 was real buildings, designed by documented architects, constructed using established techniques, operated for 6 months, then demolished for practical reasons. This is historical fact, supported by extensive evidence. But what the Exposition meant culturally, why resources were committed to temporary construction at such scale, why its disappearance generated lasting fascination, and what pattern of creation and destruction reveals about relationship between architecture and cultural values, continues to reward examination. The White City appeared, created profound impression, then vanished. What it revealed about American culture's relationship to beauty, permanence, public spectacle, and relationship between past and present remains relevant more than a century after buildings were torn down. The evidence supports conventional historical explanation, but the pattern rewards attention to what made event remarkable beyond simple facts of construction and demolition.